Hi, good afternoon. We're gonna call this meeting to order now. It is 7:01 on June 16 on 2022, and this is a public meeting of the City of Portland Police Accountability Commission. We have Ruth as a Spanish interpreter and 2 ESL interpreters, Amanda, and I don't, if the Spanish language interpreters, Ruth, can please give the information on the Spanish language interpretation?
Yes, of course. Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches a todos los que nos están escuchando el día de hoy. Estamos aquí precisamente en esta junta, en esta comitiva, con todas estas personas para una audiencia pública. Si ustedes quieren escuchar esto en español, por favor, debajo de su pantalla hay un icono de un globo terráqueo donde se pueden conectar y escuchar simultáneamente la interpretación. Cualquier duda pueden hacer una pregunta en el chat. Repito, en el globo terráqueo debajo de su pantalla, y si están en un teléfono celular, diga más o more, 3 puntitos para seleccionar su idioma. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ruth. The city also offers ASL interpretation, which is being provided by Andrea and Amanda. You can pin their video feed if that's helpful to you. Finally, the closed captioning is turned on in Zoom as another means of assistance. Please note that this is an automatic captioning services and it is not always accurate. The city supports access to meetings of the Police Accountability Commission and can provide other language support as well. Please email in advance of future public meetings, either as a response to a public meeting notice or directly to policeaccountability@portlandoregon.gov to ask for other access assistance, including interpretation into other languages. This meeting is a public meeting subject to City of Portland Administrative Code and Oregon State Law and is being recorded. For this meeting, the chat function is enabled for commission members to communicate with each other. Members of the public will be able to ask questions using Zoom Q&A feature as the commissioners are presenting and or discussing things. If attendees have questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A. We hope to use this feature to help guide our conversation during the meeting and future meetings or agenda topics. We like to be clear that not all questions will be answered during this meeting. But if answered, both the question and the answer will be visible to you and will become part of the meeting record. To access this feature, just click the Q&A icon in the middle of your screen. Thank you. Now it's time for the land acknowledgement. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. Indigenous people have created communities and summer encampments to harvest and enjoy the plentiful natural resources of the area for the last 11,000 years. We want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native people who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. We also acknowledge the systematic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Indigenous and Native American families today. As settlers and guests of these lands, we respect the work of Indigenous leaders and family and pledge to make ongoing efforts to recognize their knowledge, creativity, wisdom, and resilience. Now we're gonna review the community agreements. Instead of me reading the community agreements, what we're gonna do, we're gonna give time for each member to read it, to reflect on it, to meditate on it. And then at the end of the 2 pages of the community agreements, I'm gonna ask who, if they are in agreement to it, and if they want to continue with the meeting. Let's read the community agreements. Please, all that are agreed to these community agreements, give me their thumbs up or say yes in the chat. Thank you. Yes, I will pass it to the staff. I'm sorry, I will pass it to the co-chairs to discuss the timeline.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Simab Husseini, and I am the co-chair for this phase of the fact-finding phase. And over here, just wanted to kind of run through our timeline. The commission's currently in the fact-finding phase of our work. It's expected to go until August. It includes hearings from key stakeholders. What you have over here is just a phase that kind of breaks everything down, going through quarters almost. And as you'll see, we're in the fact-finding phase right there in the middle. As it says, following the agenda and scope document, the PAC has begun hearing from key stakeholders and outside experts, examining accountability, system models and suggested models, and understanding the barriers to accountability in the current system in Portland. As you see, the additional phases as we move forward is what we're expected to kind of run through. And then, of course, you see where we have scheduled for council consideration, where the commission will present our proposed city codes to the city council for their consideration and approval. And so, as you see, running through today, this is actually a breakdown on our current day-to-day at the top, and it'll run through the following meetings that we have on the 23rd, June 30th, and then an overview of May through August for our accountability timeline. And this is the fact-finding phase project. As you see, there have been the phases. Well, we're currently in the month of June, as you see highlighted in the yellow over here for PPB. For our PPB briefing, and that's exactly where we're currently at. This is not exact. This is just to give you guys an idea of where we're currently at and where we're expected to move forward from here.
Thank you, Co-Chair Simab. Good evening. My name is Faith Aiken. I use she, her pronouns. I am one of the co-chairs in the fact-finding phase. Good evening. It's nice to see you. Just want to provide an overview of today's meeting. So as Simab kind of oriented us to where we are overall in the fact-finding phase, tonight we are hearing from Chief LaBelle and Deputy Chief Frome. We're going to have a presentation to discuss barriers to police accountability. We'll have questions from the PAC members. We will have time for public comment and questions for Chief Lovell and Deputy Chief from the public as well. And then just a couple housekeeping items. I wanted to loop back to one being at the last full commission meeting, the question was asked, how are we going to synthesize all of these barriers? And our lovely facilitator, Christine, said we will be going over the recordings, and that is right. So I just wanted to confirm that the co-chairs, so everything that we talk about, co-chairs will be reviewing and synthesizing into a document for us to go over later in the fact-finding phase. So wanted to button that up. And that's the update. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Faith. And now we will hear from the PPB leader, Chief of Police Chuck Lovell, and Deputy Chief of Police Mike Fromm. Welcome, and we are excited that you are here at the meeting of the Police Accountability Commission.
Hello, Victoria. It's good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
To be here tonight. We wanted to come and answer any questions and help the process along how we could. Deputy Chief Fromm and I are here to answer questions. Deputy Chief has prepared a small presentation to talk about the discipline process and what it looks like when it comes to the Chief's office. But I just wanted to welcome everyone and just say we're happy to be here and happy to help in the process.
Good evening, everybody. Yeah, I'm Mike Fromm. I'm the Deputy Chief with the Portland Police Bureau. I use he, him pronouns. And I will tell you that my presentation is more of a like a short speech as opposed to anything dramatically wonderful. If we're going to talk about the Chief's office and what the role of the Chief and the Deputy Chief is when it comes to discipline at PPB, we really just have to go look at our directives initially. And you know, those are found in our directives, the 330 series. Directive 330 starts off with talking about when the internal affairs captain will notify the chief of certain types of investigations. There are some investigations that are a mandatory notification to the chief. Those would include any violation of City Human Resource Rule 2.02, which is basically the it's the harassment statute, more or less, workplace harassment. And then our directive 31020, which is also our version of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. The internal affairs captain can inform the chief of any other investigation that the chief feels is appropriate for the chief to know about. By our directives, the chief has delegated authority to investigate and process complaints made about PPB members to the IA captain. And it requires an act in writing for the chief to actually remove that authority and give it to someone else. So for example, if a complaint was made about the IA captain, the chief would in writing designate a different IA captain for the purpose of that investigation. Directive 336 talks about the police review board. Once there's the notification of an investigation, the chief and I have an extremely limited role in the disciplinary process. We largely, we're not involved in the investigation. We receive briefings from time to time on the status of how things are going. But outside of that, we do not direct or like oversee any of the investigations. Where the chief's office then next sees discipline is after the discipline has made its way either through a police review board, or if it's a case of stipulated discipline where an officer has said, my case is one that allows for an expedited resolution. May we please just go to stipulated discipline. And at that point, the chief and the commissioner in charge, the mayor, would need to decide if they would agree to that. And I'll go back to stipulated discipline in a little bit. But the police review board, you know, it's the opportunity for the peers and the assistant chief, someone from IPR, they hear details of the investigation, and then they review the facts to recommend whether or not actions are out of policy or in policy, and if they are out of policy, what discipline the police review board believes is appropriate. That recommendation is written up in a memo form. It is then through the discipline coordinator, it is sent to the chief's office, and currently it comes to me. Chief Lavelle has basically delegated the responsibility for the initial review of PRB findings to me. I then review the entire case file, read the recommended memo, and then I write my own memorandum that recommends what I believe the appropriate finding is, and if appropriate, what I think the appropriate discipline is. I then return that to the discipline coordinator, and then that memo is eventually then given to the chief, because the chief then makes the ultimate decision on what his proposed discipline is going to be. And if at the end of that time, if either the chief or I are unable to reach a decision based on the record, if we feel that there is need for additional investigation, our directive allows us to return it to internal affairs or IPR, whoever did the investigation, with specific questions that we need answered. All recommended discipline of a suspension or greater are reviewed by the chief. Lower levels of accountability, such as command counseling or letters of reprimand, if they are allowed within our discipline guide, those usually do not come to the attention of the chief's office. Those are handled at the reporting unit level. They technically, like a command counseling, for example, is not viewed as disciplinary under our system. The chief can't recommend or impose discipline until all citizen review committee appeal windows and processes are complete. So there are timing issues that we have to follow before the chief can recommend discipline or impose discipline. And if the chief does propose discipline, he does it in writing. The employee then has the right to request a predetermination meeting with the chief. We don't really refer to it as this, but most other locations, you'll hear people say it's a Loudermill hearing. If you want to look that up, it's a Supreme Court case. It's Loudermill versus, I think it's Cleveland Board of Education. It basically just stands for the idea that before you can take away an employee's property right, in this case, like pay for a suspension, you have to give them the opportunity to present their side of the story to make sure that the person imposing the discipline has really heard everything that they're supposed to hear. If the employee takes advantage of that hearing, the chief will listen to it. The chief will then send his final discipline recommendation in writing back to the discipline coordinator. The discipline coordinator would then work to impose that discipline. I talked a little bit earlier about stipulated discipline. One of our directives, 335, mentions stipulated discipline is available in cases that don't involve force, serious injury, discrimination or harassment, retaliation, disparate treatment. Nothing involved with an officer involved shooting, for example, would be eligible. These are largely what you would almost call like procedural violations. They typically do not involve, well, like I said, they don't involve anything to do with force. These can proceed to the discipline stage without a police review board if the employee requests it and if the chief and the commissioner in charge both concur that it would be appropriate. And you basically would use the discipline guide to say, this is what you violated. This is your previous disciplinary or lack of disciplinary history. Use the guide to reach like, okay, it looks like your default discipline is 1 day. Therefore, that's what we will impose. And then it allows us to skip through a few of the steps. We do have a discipline guide. The latest contract with the Portland Police Association contains a bargained corrective action guide. You know, there's been a lot of discussion in past years about, you know, the chief can impose and the commissioner in charge can impose discipline, but then it goes to an arbitration process if there's a grievance, and that sometimes the arbiter will overturn the chief's decision and impose different discipline than what the chief had tried to impose. State law has been changed that basically says if you're working with a bargain corrective action guide, it limits the arbiter's ability to go outside of what the recommended discipline is if they find that there is a violation and we have a bargain guide. So that's one of our benefits that we're working with now. That kind of ends my general overview of the chief's office involvement. I mean, like I said, we're involved very little at the beginning with kind of like a notice. There's some monitoring during the process to see where we at in terms of timelines for things, but then neither one of us really see the entire investigation and do any decision making until the very end, generally after there has been a police review board. I invite the chief to make any comments that he'd like now about kind of his aspect of when he gets things at the end.
Yeah, and I'd also say too, there are some times where, depending on what the allegation is, we have to make a decision where if someone is placed on administrative leave or if they can continue working. Some of that depends on the circumstances. It depends on, is it safe for this person to be, in workspace with other people? What's the nature of the complaint? Is it maybe in this person's best interest to not be at work while this is going on, or is the allegation so severe that this person could be terminated and we don't want them to have any interaction with the public if they're working patrol or something like that during the time frame of the investigation. So we'll make that determination sometimes early on in an investigation. And then for my part, by the time the discipline gets to me, it has already been through the performance review board or all the other steps that Deputy Chief Frome has talked about. And I essentially get a memo with a recommendation. And then typically the officer will have the to come and sit in the Loudermill hearing or the predetermination hearing and give any pertinent information, explain their side of the story, give me any information they want to share before I come to my decision. But I'm at the very, very end of that chain, and I make a determination based on the information presented to me and the recommendations from the board.
When the board invited us tonight, they'd ask us to possibly discuss what we thought were barriers, like current barriers in the system, and like what are barriers to accountability, and then like also what's working. And just on for my personal opinions on this, I would say that one of the current barriers in our system is I think it's a very complex process, and it tends to take a lot of time. And if you draw a flow chart of our system, I think most people will just like shake their head at like, why are there so many steps? And then, another barrier in our current system, I think, is it's the perception of the current system itself. Like right now, most of the police officers don't like our current system and find it to be unfair. And I think there are a great number of citizens who don't like our system and find it unfair. And when you have a system that has no buy-in on either end, I think that's why we're here with the Accountability Commission. In terms of what works, I think from where I sit, the investigations are usually very, very thorough, and there's a mechanism in place to return them for additional questions. So it's not as if at different stages during this process, you can't like ask that one extra question if you need it. So the system has the ability to gather a lot of information and try to seek some sort of a truth. And then the system does contain opportunities for both sides to ask for some sort of review. There is appeal ability by people that make complaints. And then, as we talked about, like with the predetermination or the Loudermill hearing, the employee has the ability to ask the chief for like a second look as well. So I think both of those things are still working. I'm sure the chief might have a couple of ideas on his own.
I agree with what Deputy Chief Frome said. I think sometime, particularly on the stuff that becomes lower level discipline, the process is so long that the process in a way becomes the punishment. We have a lot of folks who may have a bump in the road, may have made a mistake, and really want to move on with their careers. And some of these investigations take, over a year to complete, depending on, the nature of the investigation. And, people, find that hard to have something like that hanging over their head for that period of time, and then ultimately results in, some lower level of discipline as well. So I think that is probably the biggest complaint we hear about the process itself. And then I think, to me, just personally, I always feel like, we have to ask ourselves constantly, is this the best system? Is, a day off or a letter fix a problem? Is there some other way that we could come to a resolution that maybe provides a little bit more voice to the person on the other end of the complaint? Sometimes a letter in someone's file or a day off doesn't really have an impact on the person who goes through the discipline process. Maybe having more of a restorative discipline process or an education-based discipline process would be more beneficial to both parties. And I think, that's always subject to bargaining. There's unions and things of that nature. But I think those are really the questions we have to all kind of ask ourselves from time to time as we look at these processes and try to improve them, look at different ways to approach them.
And then the final words I had kind of thought about for tonight during the presentation form of it, we were asked what are some outcomes for the Accountability Commission that we would like to see or we're hoping for. And I think I'm hoping for 4 things. I'm hoping for a system that balances speed of investigation with demands for thoroughness, a system that's fair to all involved, that has adequate safeguards built in, a system that results in predictable discipline, and a system that allows for some sort of fast-track stipulated discipline for appropriate cases. I think I was thinking about it. I didn't really give anyone a good example of like what a case could be that might be appropriate for like this stipulated discipline. And one of the things that an officer can get in trouble for is, for example, like failure to write a report. And generally, an officer is going to know if they fail to write a report or not. And so that's not really an issue. All we're really talking about at that point is like, what is the appropriate discipline? So in that particular case, I think it would be completely appropriate if an officer says, yes, I'm just going to stipulate that I did this. Can we please just move to where we're at? And under our new corrective action guide, one of the things that it takes into account is training in lieu of some hours of like suspension. So instead of just like, okay, you failed to write that report, we're going to give you a day off with no pay. It will allow you to receive remedial training on perhaps you're going to, sit down and learn about additional, like what are all the mandatory reports you have to do in lieu of just getting, your pay docked. So hopefully that helps illustrate that a little bit more.
And I would say too, just, I think the biggest thing that I think about in just general terms are just fairness and trust. I think people want a system that's fair. The predictability, like DC Frome mentioned, is really good. But I think in order for people to believe in the system and trust in this system, it has to be fair, and there has to be a real, I think, eye to fairness. I think that's important to have that legitimacy going forward. And I think it's also, fair to mention too, there's a lot of kind of rudimentary police work type things in our process too, that aren't like, glaring misconduct. It's like, hey, you've had your 3rd vehicle crash in, 5 months. How do we correct that? What's the proper steps? I mean, it's not something necessarily that's, super glaring or headline grabbing or, this is a huge disciplinary issue, but there's a lot of things like that. It's small procedural things or things that just need correction that are the course of doing business that are part of this process too. And I think it's important to kind of remember those as well.
And it doesn't have anything to do with our presentation, but I just now had the opportunity to take a look at the chat. I'd like to throw my thanks to the support staff. Your ability to throw the stuff that I've been talking about in on the fly is amazing. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Now, thank you for the presentation. And now we will take questions and let Chief Lovell and Deputy Chief Fromm respond to them. Please keep your questions brief. Allow me to facilitate this Q&A, and please ask questions that help the Commission move towards identifying barriers to police accountability and best practices, which is the purpose of this phase of work. Thank you. Okay, and I have, okay. Yeah, Commissioner Lovíza, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to our guests. Thank you, Chief Lovell, and thank you, Deputy Chief Fromm, for being with us today and for giving us that overview. That was really helpful. I wanted to return to some of the kind of best practices that Deputy Chief Fromm had mentioned. You'd mentioned some things that are going really well in the current system, or things that work fairly well, or that the investigations are very thorough and that they are able to gather a lot of information. And I guess I wanted to ask, one, how are you doing that? How are you gathering that information? And then two, is it always a good thing? Are you getting the information that you want to get? Does it ever, I mean, you know, another barrier that you had mentioned is that, you know, they're very complex and they take a lot of time. So I'm wondering if the data gathering is a part of that complexity and the investigations taking a long time.
Chief, if you don't mind, I'll go first on this one. Yeah, I think you're, yeah. There's times where there's very technical information that needs to get gathered related to some of these investigations, especially in the digital age where you might be trying to get a hold of, you know, tracking information out of vehicles or, you know, cell phone records, or there's a lot of that does take time. And then you can get a huge volume of information that it just takes time to distill down. And so I think at times that that definitely gets in the way. What I have found personally that, and maybe this is something I should have put in on like something for the future on this one. There are definitely times where I read the file and I think to myself, I think the violation or the possible violation of this directive is better figured out by asking this line of questions. And the investigator has a really good idea of what they think needs to be done in terms of that. So sometimes I wonder if there's a way to try to, at the outset, match up what the people that are eventually going to be the finders of fact on this, how do you match up their vision for where they think there might be an investigative path versus where the investigators do? Because I just think that sometimes that would eliminate us having to send it back. I mean, I'll be honest, I've sent things back before where it's like, ask them these 5 questions, because if they answer these 5 questions, then I'm going to know whether or not the way that I think something was violated or not violated happened. So I'd throw that out.
Yeah, I would say, you know, we do a really good job for the most part doing these investigations. They are lengthy, and some of the things that take time are kind of out of our control sometimes. It's not super uncommon for some people that we need to interview on a case who might be off on leave. We got to schedule things around their representation, and there's a lot of pieces that we learned during the investigation that we now have to add, you know, different branches. Perhaps, okay, now we have to go look for, you know, this video, this data, check these phone records, and now we have to interview these other 4 people who might have been you know, involved, and find this person that this person describes. And, you know, they kind of leads, you know, 1 step leads to 3 more steps sometimes. And I think that's good for the investigation. It makes it more thorough, but it does sometimes make it more time consuming. And there are going to be some, and very few, fortunately, that have a criminal piece to them that we now have to wait for that part to be done before we can do some of our internal administrative stuff. So, I mean, I think it is good, but all these are factors in why it does end up taking so long.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer. And now we'll go with Commissioner Fate.
Hi, good evening. Yeah, thank you for the information, helpful. I'm going to ask a pretty big question, and I recognize it's a big question. We're really tasked with thinking through and recommending a system, and I appreciate you mentioning restorative processes, Chief Lavelle, and I think we can't correct for cultural problems that are happening. Like when you're in a disagreement, if someone says, I'll correct this action, that doesn't repair the relationship. And so I'm curious what your perspective is as we help develop a system. How does that come alongside some cultural change to repair and restore the relationship between PPB and the city?
Yeah, I think it can be, I don't think it has to be either or. I think it could be kind of part and parcel of a bigger system, kind of like the stipulated discipline that Chief Frome talked about. I think in some cases, there really makes sense to have an off-ramp where, there's the flexibility to really let people feel heard. I think there's times in our system where someone makes a complaint and whatever the resolution of that complaint is, doesn't make that person feel whole. I think sometimes that person might feel like, hey, if I had a chance to talk to the officer about, how what they did made me feel, I would feel better than just knowing, or maybe never even finding out, that a letter got put in their file, a letter that, the officer may, frankly, never even read potentially. And I feel like there's some instances where it's like that makes more sense. Everyone in the process would be better served by that versus the discipline. But I think if we're creative, there could maybe be a way where both of those avenues were available, depending on the situation.
Thank you. Commissioner Jason? You are on mute, or you don't, okay. That's completely fine. Is there more questions? Oh, Commissioner Dan, please.
Yes, good evening, Chief and Deputy Chief. This is Dan Handelman. You know me from the group Portland Cop Watch. Tonight I'm here as a member of the commission, and I use he, him pronouns. And I got to make a couple of quick comments before I ask my question. The first comment is I'm sure, Chief Lavelle, about the issue you're just talking about, that that there's a mediation program that the IPR offers to some officers so that civilians can talk to each other. I was really glad to hear you talking about how the civilian's voice is really important in the complaint process, and so that's why it's troubling that the civilians aren't allowed into the police review board hearing, or for that matter, they don't have a chance to talk to you at the end of the process in the same way the officers do through this Loudermill hearing. So that's something to think about in terms of fairness. So my question is, how do we make sure that things don't happen in the future where something goes all the way through the system and the new board by the charter, supposedly will be able to make impose the discipline, but how do we make sure that that doesn't get changed somehow down the line through either this Loudermill hearing, or an example I'll give is there was a case where an officer told a protester that they weren't allowed to record them, which the officer knew was not true, and the allegation against them for truthfulness was found out of policy, but then former Chief Outlaw changed it from untruthfulness finding to a performance violation. So how are we going to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen, where there's a whole investigation and findings get made and then something gets switched at the end? Can you kind of explain to me to make sure how we can make sure that that won't happen in the future? Thank you.
Sure, I'll start and then maybe DC Frome can chime in. But I think that would be a matter of the procedures that get put in place. I think now there's the places where things tend to change are at the mitigation hearing level or at arbitration. I think those are the two that come to mind that are the biggest kind of detours from where the path is originally going. And I think sometimes, like DC Frome mentioned, sometimes it does make sense to look at the allegation and figure out, is this the right allegation? Does this one make sense based upon what the information gathered says? And other times I think, it's pretty clear in the beginning. But I think, how do you prevent it? I think it's really going to be a matter of what procedures and what barriers, kind of bumpers, if you will, are put in place for that kind of thing. But I think, you know, as you build this out, it might make sense to have a little leeway in that area. But I think it would have to be, if you're going to have a way to prevent it, it would have to be a procedural way, I'm assuming.
Thank you, Chief. And now Commissioner Jason.
DC Fromm was going to respond as well.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, my response
Okay.
was going to be, I did not have much to add to that other than the way to prevent something from happening is to just very clearly in the policies, in the rules, establish what can or can't be done at various stages. I mean, that to me, that is the simplest way to ensure that you don't have happen what Mr. Handelman described.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Commissioner Jason.
Could you describe how your investigative process differs between an administrative investigation and a criminal investigation?
I'll jump on that one first. So a criminal investigation, well, I'll go backwards. With an administrative investigation, we have the ability to compel an officer to talk to us because as our employee, we have the right to ask them questions about their behavior. And so we can come in and we can order them to speak to us, and then we can use that information to support findings in an administrative investigation. Whereas in a criminal investigation, we don't have the power to force them or make them to talk to us. If they want to, they can invoke the same Fifth Amendment right that anyone else can. So that's the main primary difference that we see. And what we have developed over time is that when we have officers that are involved in conduct that is, you know, has potential criminal as well as violate our directive implications, we conduct completely separate investigations where the investigators on both sides are unaware really of, well, especially the criminal side. The criminal side is not aware of what the administrative side knows. The administrative side can learn what the criminal side knows because it's not going to be as problematic. So you have to find a way to have two separate investigations running. We generally run them in parallel to a certain point, but then the criminal matter will take over and become more important as the DA decides, you know, is this going to grand jury? Will there be a criminal indictment? And then sometimes the results of the actual criminal trial all the way will prevent us from continuing the administrative side until there's a determination of guilt, innocence, and maybe some of our witnesses are tied up in the criminal matter and are unable to speak to us in the administrative side. I hope that answered your question.
Well, a little bit of it. It seems like we're getting into an area of conflicts of interest. How do you assure yourself? What's your quality assurance method of maintaining no conflict of interest between these various parties? And maybe also, at what point do you punt this to an outside agency? A criminal investigation.
I think we will look to an outside agency when for example, if we had a detective who was alleged to have committed a crime, we would definitely not have our own detectives be investigating them. We would probably seek another source. Generally, for example, if an officer is alleged to have done something that involved drugs or vice type related things, we would have officers from our narcotics and organized crime unit investigate them. We would not have someone from that unit investigate. If, for example, there was an allegation that I did something criminal, I feel that we would immediately go outside to try to find an outside person. It's situational, depending on our ability to think, can we say with a straight face that there's not like inappropriateness in the investigation there. And that's something that we talk about as at the beginning, when like the IA captain would be coming to us and saying like, hey, here's what our problem is. Most of the time, criminal allegations come through the chain of command first before they go to IA, and then we have to notify internal affairs and the assistant chief of investigations. And at that early stage is where like, okay, what is the plan and what is going to be good here? We usually reach out to the district attorney. The district attorney has a person who is pretty much handles all of the like investigating the police calls. And we would also depend upon that person to say, you guys can't do this. Look outside.
Thank you.
And sometimes there are people in our organization too that have had, you know, a long working relationship with maybe the DA's office or people, you know, outside of the police bureau, but in this investigative process. And in those instances too, we do talk about, hey, is this, you know, something we want to send to another DA's office because of this relationship or, you know, this past working connection. So, I mean, those are all things we do talk about. And sometimes we do look for other counties or other people to do investigations for us.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. And now we will pass to Commissioner Charlie.
Good evening, Charlie Michelle Wesley. I have two questions, one for Chief Deputy Fromm. And you were talking about this, there was a law passed in regards to arbitration. And I was wondering if you can explain those changes a little bit clearer and maybe with an example of how that's made things fairer and or more just.
Yeah, sure, I'll try. And the law is still actually so new that I don't think it's been tested yet. I don't think we've had a case go to arbitration yet where we would see it. You know, I'm gonna have to paraphrase this. I don't have the actual text of it in front of me, so this is going off my memory. And I'm sure there are other people, maybe even people here, that are going to know this better than me. But in the past, what you would see is Police Bureau has recommended termination for an employee based on like untruthfulness. And therefore, we move to terminate the employee. The employee would then file a grievance, and then that grievance would end up in front of an arbitrator. The arbitrator would hear all the evidence, and then the arbiter would say, I have heard all the evidence, and I don't believe that this was truthfulness, and overturn it, and then say, but I do think that maybe there was like inappropriate lack of action, and instead of termination, the appropriate discipline would be like a letter of reprimand. And then it would come back to the Police Bureau, and then we are in a position where we have to reinstate the employee. The way that I believe that the law now works is that the issue in front of the arbiter is, you know, they're not allowed to, they can either say, yes, there was a violation, or no, but then they can't get in and like suggest alternatives to what was going on. And then if the discipline is part of a bargain guide, if they find that the action actually happened, they can't deviate the discipline. Because sometimes in the past, the arbiter would be like, oh yeah, they did do this, you know, they did violate your force directive, but we think termination was too harsh of a penalty, and so therefore we're going to reinstate the person, or ask you to reinstate the person with maybe 1 week off. That will go away, because if the arbiter determines that there was a violation and the discipline was according to the bargained corrective action guide, then the arbiter must follow the discipline from the guide. So I think that's going to be lending certainty in the future. And like I said, we haven't had it happen.
Okay, thank you. My second question is for Chief LaBelle. Just to put this out on the table, the whole reason this commission was created was, you know, that the voters voted for over 82% of police accountability, and to the Black Lives Matters uprising due to the shooting deaths disproportionately of Black, Brown, etc. People. And so, Chief LaBelle, what do you see as the major barriers to address this? I mean, this was an uprising not just here, but across the United States and the world. So yeah, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, I think, you know, in terms of just police accountability in general, I think people, voters came to the conclusion that they want police accountability to be at the forefront. And I think here in Portland, it was a big issue. You see the margin in which it passed by. And they say, hey, we want a system that is accountable. We want to try to do something different than what we're doing, you know, currently. And I think that's, you know, what the voters were saying here in Portland. And I think, you know, to the extent that we could build a system that people, you know, trust and have faith in, and that works and does the job that it's, you know, people are setting out to build the system to do, then I think that could be a really good thing. Like DC Fromm said, there's a lot of, I think, angst with our current system. It's a system that, you know, very few people, I think, would stand up and say, hey, this system works really well, and people, you know, think it's really good. So, you know, to that extent, I think, you know, it's incumbent on all of us to figure out what we want the system to do, how we want to build it, and how, you know, we think it should be holding law enforcement accountable.
Yeah, no easy task.
No. If it were easy,
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Charlotte. Thank you, Chief, for answering. Commissioner Debbie?
Hi, Debbie Iona. I'm a commission member, obviously, she, her. Sorry. So first I was just going to say the questions in the Q&A look really intriguing. If we have time, it'd be really nice to be able to ask them of our guests. And then I was just curious, I went to those open meetings for the contract discussion and was really interested in the proposal to, you've already alluded to this, about not just everything being disciplined, but instead sometimes the consequences would be, you know, you get some extra training or, and I feel like I even remembered them talking about the possibility of maybe some community service or something. So if you could give more details about what ended up in the final contract, about the kinds of things that aren't necessarily disciplined, but more ways to, the more restorative approach. I would appreciate that.
yeah, that might be it. I wasn't part of the actual bargaining for that piece of it. I think Chief Fromm probably has a better sense of what was kind of talked about and finalized there. But I do personally agree, like there are certain instances where I think that really is the better route to take. And I think, you know, there's a lot of departments now talking about, you know, what's called, you know, restorative discipline in some circles, that I think, you know, it works well when we talk about community, but it works well internally too. And I think, you know, the goal for me, I think, is to have people come away from some type of complaint or encounter that maybe didn't go right, and see things differently than they did before. Whether that's exposure to some folks, hearing people's story that they didn't know before, getting more education, training, enlightenment, and saying, hey, I see how, you know, the way I thought about this or this action I took really maybe wasn't the best step. And now I know better, I understand better, and now I can do better going forward. So that's just my general take on it. But DC Fromm might have more of the particulars from the talks that took place.
Yeah, I mean, the language that ends up in the corrective action guide is it's very brief, and it basically talks about remedial training or independent study. When we were talking with the PPA about this, it was left fairly open-ended, because I think there was some desire for us to have the ability to tailor the education-based, or whatever you wanted to call it, to the problem. And it shouldn't just be like, oh, hey, you did this, so you have to do X, because that doesn't mean it's actually going to address it. And so I think moving forward, as we start encountering cases that use the new corrective guide, I think it will be it will be up to the Bureau to try to find creative and interesting ways to make that a meaningful experience, rather than just go sit over here and read some directives and watch this video on how to do this better.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. Commissioner Sophia?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I have a question. It's two general ones, and you've probably answered part of it as you've gone through some of the other questions with the other commissioners. My name is Sophia Glenn. I'm one of the commissioners here. And I hear the constant discussion of trust, trust between the public, trust between the police. And my question or my comment is, what has been done with the police bureau to kind of foster more trust? That's one question. The other question is, knowing that this is a thing that we all have to do together, does the police department have, or the bureau have, a list of things for the commission that they say, that you would say that is not working or is working better, or what we can improve on? What are the things that are working good and what are not working good? I mean, a real list of them, not just off in the middle of this meeting, so that we can have something concrete to work from. So that's my questions and my comments, and I'll leave it for you all. Thank you.
Yeah, you kind of broke up a little bit. I'll start with the trust piece, because that's just an important foundational piece. And I think, you know, from the police bureau standpoint, we're constantly doing things that I think help or will help and move us closer to trust. But it's one of those things that's hard to measure. One of the first things that we did was we moved the equity office under the chief's office. It wasn't located there before. I wanted to have my equity and inclusion folks directly attached to the chief's office. And this would give them more of an overview to what goes on in the organization. And they wouldn't be necessarily just under this division, able to maybe have some insight here or there. It gives them a lot broader access to the chiefs and a lot broader view of the organization. I think that's really important. One of the other things we did is we brought in a program called ABLE, Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement. You know, I think one of the big questions coming out of the George Floyd murder was, hey, you know, how is it that these officers were right here when this was happening and no one did anything? What does that say about culture, and what does that say about people's empowerment to intervene? And ABLE, what that does is it's a practical way to address bystandership, and it teaches officers how to intervene in those situations, and it gives people in the organization the ability to, and it gives permission from everyone throughout the organization to do that if you see that happening. Because I don't want to be, you know, the person on the front page of the newspaper when something bad happens and know my fellow coworkers didn't do anything to help me. And we're taking on a lot of different things, I think, that fall under the category of reform that just don't get a lot of attention in that category. We have a new LGBTQIA2S+ policy that addresses you know, some issues we've had in the past with community, with the LGBTQIA2S+ community, and lets people know, hey, we take this seriously. We have a directive now that speaks to it directly. We train our officers how to interact and how to best serve that community. We've got public safety support specialists, which are community service officers who are non-sworn and they're unarmed, but they're a kind of public facing real community engagement piece of the police bureau. And that's something, you know, we didn't have a couple of years ago. It's something we're doing differently. We're looking at a restorative justice program and things of that nature. I think those all fall under the category of, hey, we're doing things differently. We're trying to make changes that'll build trust and move us closer to community. It's just, you know, all these things that we're doing don't necessarily all get blasted out to community at the same time, but we're actually working on a lot of things internally that I think will ultimately bring that trust factor up between police and community.
Thank you, Chief. Now I'm going to pass it to Commissioner Catherine.
Thank you. I'm Catherine McDowell, and I just want to say thank you for being here tonight. I have a couple of questions. The first follows up on your comment that the current system, you know, doesn't have neither the members of the Bureau or the community have a lot of faith in it. And I guess I just had a question whether you are aware of other departments and other jurisdictions that have a system that you think does it better. We're in the process of researching other jurisdictions, so appreciate if you have any feedback on that. So that's my first question. And my second is around timelines. Are you aware of any accountability systems that have set timelines or presumptive timelines for the investigative process to ensure that the process doesn't drag on so long that no one's satisfied with the outcome? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start this one. We have a kind of a presumptive 180-day timeline in general for us. But I think, in terms of who does it well, I don't know if I have anyone off the top of my head who I could say, hey, these folks have it nailed. This is the kind of gold standard of system of discipline. Maybe Chief Frome does, but I think in some ways, every place is a little different depending on the organization, what the community expectations are, and things of that nature. And I suspect, Portland being Portland, we'll probably have something that's not quite like any place else. But I think time is important. You want to have enough time to do it well and do it to the best of your ability. But I think the longer that these investigations go, the harder it is for all parties involved. So I think it's kind of finding that sweet spot. It's like threading the needle between, timely, well done, and well received by the masses.
Thank you. And before I pass it to Eric, I want to say we will go with Eric, then Sima, because he was raising his hand before and he hasn't participated. And then Tirsa is another commissioner that hasn't participated. And then I will back to Charlie and Sophia. Thank you. Please, Commissioner Eric, go ahead.
All right, thank you. And good evening. And Chief Lavelle and Deputy Chief Frome, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. You both talked about the fact that the current system isn't necessarily perceived as fair by either the officers or the community. And one of the things that we've discussed quite a bit and struggle with is how do we make sure that as a body that was commissioned really by community groundswell, how would you suggest that we meaningfully engage the PPA and the officers to on this issue in a non-confrontational manner so that they feel like they've at least been heard in the process? Do you have any thoughts about how would you suggest we go about that?
Yeah, I'll start. I think honestly, it's just bringing them to the table and talking to them. The PPA president now, I think, is very open to having discussions about this topic and about just accountability and their views on accountability. And I think I think just about everybody, or definitely most people in law enforcement, would say, hey, accountability is important. It's a hard thing to nail, but it's something that I think requires bringing people to the table, no matter what their perspective is. I think it's worthwhile to hear, what people's views are, what they think are barriers, what they think they'd like to see, or what they think would be detrimental to a process. And I think it's just that. It's just bringing folks to the table, letting them feel heard, and just saying, hey, we want to build the best system we can. We want to get your input as we go through the process.
Thank you.
Thank you. And before I pass it to Sima, Tirsa, then Charlie and Sophia. After Sophia, we will have to go to take public comment. And when we take public comment, I will read the questions that are in the Q&A. Thank you. Commissioner Sima?
Yes, greetings, Chief Lavelle, DC Frome, Simab Husseini, co-chair for our fact-finding phase, here with the Police Accountability Commission. Yep, from what I'm hearing, there's an incredibly complex bureaucratic process that just to create accountability for disciplining an officer than there is for those that they persecute. And it's not to equate with one or the other, but again, there's an aspect that's a bit compelling for those of us that actually have lived experience. And you both seem very informed on the process, this new process regarding discipline and the discipline guide and the limitations as to how the chief engages. Some of this was very familiar when the mayor, Mayor Ted Wheeler, was on a few weeks ago, explaining, his role towards the very end. And it kind of minimized that role as like, after all this process, it comes to us and we're far removed from this and we make our decisions from there. A limited subset of decisions that you guys are able to kind of engage and make on. I apologize, but a lot of prefacing here. And even though, a lot of these changes have been untested, I would encourage that, the public knows an aspect of a public that I advocate to learn and hear more from, and also advocate to teach as a community organizer, that you still have Lehman, Taylor, Damerville, Kammerer. We can go on a few names. They're all still there and there's been zero repercussions for officers since 2020 protests. And understandably so, like there's lines at which you guys can't cross when you speak on accountability. And that's what I'm kind of getting at here. To be honest, that within policing, transparency is hidden behind a lot of bureaucracy. There's limitations as to what you guys can really say to us. And with those limitations, that's where trust becomes and is the barrier. How would we ever trust what you have to say? We can trust that a bureaucratic process and it's clean and it's explainable, confusing, but explainable. And within that is the inability to be able to ever really feel like, we'd be speaking to people at such a high level that know a bureaucratic process, but, untested and it's new. So therefore, whereas transparency is like the big maybe. And, you have lines of code that prevent you from speaking in low bar disparagement about your bureau. And this comes from your PPA contract and just, the way you guys interact with everyone else. The apparatus is always set to basically protect yourselves. And that's the transparency that needs to be broken, right? So what I'm kind of getting at over here is that what would it take to hear from the top tier leaders like yourselves, DC, chief, to be able to try and actually speak on issues and have those barriers removed? What would it take for you to become tools of advocacy within your systems of bureaucracy to allow yourselves to speak more freely and to hold those more accountable and remove these barriers of bureaucracy to make yourselves more empowered to create systems of accountability that are attainable? Big question, may not get an answer, but that, spherically, that's where I'm from.
Yeah, and I don't know if I have a direct answer, but it is a good question. I would say this, like, you are right. There are systems that exist. There's things, there's all kinds of players in these processes. There's unions, there's, contracts, there's, one, I think what you alluded to is often referred to as the embarrassment clause, things you can say or can't say. And I think, there's times as management where you want to go down a certain road with discipline or accountability, and you are, you're barred from that either by, an arbitrator's decision or, a guide or something that's out there that's part of the process that has you kind of boxed into some degree. And those things exist in our system. And I think that's always kind of been a little bit of the rub between management and labor as far as the unions go. And I think, you know, we build these systems, and then when we do, we look at them later and say, this thing we built does not meet, you know, the need we need or the intention that we had when we set out. And I think that's, you know, kind of what we see now with not just police academy, but a lot of systems in our society today. So I think you're right. And I see where you're coming from there. And I think it's, you know, as a chief, you want to have the ability to, you know, make those decisions and have them be the final decisions. But unfortunately, the system we have today, like you said, it has many layers of bureaucracy and things that prevent you from doing maybe what you would want to do ultimately.
Thank you for the answer.
Do you mind if I address
Sure,
that?
go ahead. Mhm.
Yeah, I echo the chief. The way to get the chief and the deputy chief to be able to speak freely about what they think is going on, honestly, is you would have to completely remove us out of the discipline process. Because the way that everything else works, even if we change all of our directives, and even if we change the way that this commission puts in a new accountability system, we still have years and years of labor law that's going to get in our way when they eventually start, you know, appealing these things to arbitrators. So you'd have to find a way to make us, we have a pulpit, but we don't really have the actual decision-making policy. And if it makes you any more relieved, Officer Damerville is no longer an employee of the Portland Police Bureau.
Thank you. Commissioner Tirsa?
Hello, Tirsa, she, her. So I'm kind of going back to what something that Chief Lavelle and DC from have mentioned about possibly wanting to see the investigation process work a little faster, be more efficient. And a few weeks ago, we had IPR do a presentation, and they expressed that one thing that would also make their work more efficient is having direct access to police reports, law enforcement records. And so hearing what you are saying and hearing what they are saying, I guess I'm wondering if what would it take for IPR to have direct access to those records to be able to work more efficiently alongside the Bureau?
I don't think anything stands in the way of that. Laws were changed during the last legislature that made it very clear that agencies that were involved in oversight of the police were going to be able to have access to that. It was my understanding that we'd already began conversations with IPR to ensure that the folks down in Salem that control leads were not going to have a heart attack over us opening that up. So I don't think that's something that is going to be a major roadblock in the future.
Thank you. And now we will go back to Commissioner Charlie and then Commissioner Sophia and then public comment.
Thank you. Okay, I won't reintroduce myself, but what if that embarrassment clause was to be removed? And then what prevents, I mean, how does the PPB culture still prevent honest dialogue? It just seems like that's been a real issue forever in our police system, our policing system, that, you know, you just are not able to actually speak openly and honestly about what would really best suit the public as far as safety. That's just my first question. I just want to suggest also that looking at restorative instead of, transformative instead of restorative, because we can't really restore something that we haven't had. So that's yeah. And whoever wants to answer that, I think that so many of our issues as well come from police that are acting, whether intentionally or unintentionally, from a racist, through a racist lens. So how do we train? I mean, all the training in the world, how do we address that? Even if there is inclusivity and equity training, I mean, it would have to be so extensive. So I know that's a lot right there, but.
Thank you, Commissioner Charlie. And we have to just answer Commissioner Charlie and then Commissioner Sophia, but I will ask Commissioner Sophia and the answers to be short, fast and shorter because we need to do public comment. And I'm sorry, Commissioner Lovisa, we have time after public comment. I will come back for your question.
And I would just say just a general answer to what Charlie said. I think some of it is the environment. It's like you have to create an environment where, you know, open dialogue can happen. And I think, you know, the embarrassment clause, to me, it's like, you know, as a chief, I'm not here to disparage anyone or, you know, necessarily try to embarrass folks, but I do want to be able to talk honestly about issues that are, you know, affecting the public trust, whether it's something an officer did or something within the organization that I feel could be better or changed. But I think it's really having an environment where you can have that open dialogue. Because I think even internally, when we talk about things, I think it's difficult sometimes for officers to feel like, well, I can really share my views or kind of share what I think about this, but I'm worried someone might take it the wrong way and I might end up with a complaint of some type. And I really want to encourage people, you know, to have those conversations. If we can't have them internally, how can I expect officers to have them with the public? But I think it has to be, I don't want to say safe because I think some people overuse that, like this is a safe space or safe environment, but I think it's courageous space usually. And you have to be willing to put yourself out there a little bit, but we as leaders have to create an environment where we can have honest dialogue, either with each other internally, with our members, with the public. And I think sometimes there's a big apprehension because people feel like, well, if I come out and say something that someone doesn't like or takes a certain way, then I will end up in trouble somehow.
Thank you, Chief. And Commissioner Sophia, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I was just going back to my second part of the question from earlier. And then there's been a lot of answering in between. But the question I had, the second part was, you know, can the Police Bureau provide us a list of issues or barriers or problems and the things that, you know, you want to see it as working well in the new system? I mean, literally, have something for us to sit down and look at and work from. I know you've mentioned quite a few of them as we've been talking here, but it would really be good if this collaboration is going to be going well, is to actually give us something to work from, something that we can sit down and work on. And then the other question is, you know, how can you change the culture? And we've kind of been talking about that. You've mentioned that in pretty much all your questions that are the answers that you've provided for Chief and also Mr. Frome. That, you know, how do you change that culture? How do you get it to the point? I mean, that's another suggestion that you might be able to provide with us. I know it's complicated. I know the system is complicated. I know that there's a culture there, a culture and a climate that the police feel. I mean, I've been in the military, it's the same. It's a culture. And
Commissioner Sophia, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You are cutting off, but we have to. You already asked the question. We have to go to the answer. I'm sorry. Okay.
I'll start with just a brief thing. You know, honestly, I think that's a good question. Like, what are the barriers as we build this? We want to have something concrete we can look at, a list or something like that. I think it maybe makes sense to, you know, you have two people here who are pretty high up in the decision-making process, but I think it might be worthwhile to really pull a broader view of officers, people that are, work in that system, in the investigation side, internal affairs side, and officers who have gone through it, and really see from their perspective a broad sense of what they like and don't like, what they'd like to see continue or be made better, and what things they'd like to see removed. I think maybe a survey or something like that would really be beneficial and help you build out that list from a wide variety of perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone that participated. Now we will not take public comment of the issues discussed on the chief briefing. We ask members of the public to keep their comments or questions to 2 minutes in length at most, and raise their hand in Zoom if they would like to speak. And because it takes a little bit, I'm gonna read the 2 questions that are in questions Q&A, and then if you wanna provide an answer. The first question is from Jasmine, and she said, what role does transparency play in the balance of public bureau trust in the system? And thank you, Jasmine, for that question. The second question is from Philip, and this is a very broad question. How can the public be confident the investigators, the people who decide the discipline, the people who write the police directives, and the union contract negotiators are not biased in favor of the police? Thank you, Philip, for your question.
Chief, if it's okay, I'll jump on. I think we can talk about both of these questions in kind of the same way, because they both kind of hit back at the need for transparency in a system that allows enough people to see what is going on, to understand what's going on, and then perceive if there is bias. The people who complain about police behavior probably are going to expect a certain degree of privacy unless they're okay with becoming public figures in it. So any system is going to have a certain amount of respect for the privacy of the person who is making the complaint against the police. So I think what we really talk about when we talk about transparency in the process is, and I may be way off base on this one, what if we had a system where you could go to a website somewhere and it has a list of all pending cases that are just identified by number and like a very general description of what the complaint is, and there's an update, like every week or two there's an update of like what stage is this in. All right, so people are able to track the way things are moving. At the end we need to find a way to adequately, the Bureau has given public, I guess you would call them summaries of discipline, and yeah, we don't name the officers in them. You get Officer A, Officer B, Officer C. That might not be enough for transparency moving into the future. That's a big hurdle that we're going to have to cross, and I'm sure that the police union is going to have some very strong feelings with that one. In terms of, are the investigators biased? The ability of other people to be involved in the system so that over time they become familiar with these investigators. There's not thousands or hundreds of them. There's ones that you get to know over time. You're going to be able to know whether or not they are consistently, showing biases or are always coming down on one side, no matter what the evidence seems to be. So I don't know if I really answered the question, but I think transparency and figuring out the right balance between complainant privacy and like general public need to know in order to have trust, that's the balance. That's where we have to find it.
And I would add, one of the things we do as far as directives is, we put our directives out for universal. So we put them out to the public for public comment. And then we make updates and, changes based on the feedback we get. Depending on the directive, sometimes we get a lot of good feedback, other times we don't get much, but we always put it out there to make sure that the public has an opportunity to weigh in. And, I think that's been helpful for us, just as we, try to think through something we think is a really good policy. Someone I know Dan's very familiar with this process, provide comments, and it gives us sometimes things we didn't think of, another perspective, like, oh, okay, maybe we should change this or tweak that or do this thing a little differently. And I think, that's one way where we really try to be less insular and siloed about, the things that we do as a police bureau. We open them up to the public to have their input in those.
Thank you. And the last question from the public is, how do you keep politics out of police accountability?
I don't know if you can.
Yeah,
we're here because of politics. Politics led to the Accountability Commission. We have an elected official who is the head of, the director in charge of the police bureau. I just don't know how to undo it.
Chief, you wanna add something?
No, I think it's the same. I think if it can be done, I or Chief Rome have not figured out how to do it. Maybe it's just part of this system that's, something we have to accept to a degree, but I don't know if we could ever be successful of totally keeping politics out of it, at least not here in our current system. I think it'd be very difficult.
Thank you. And thank you for every member of the public that sent their questions. We appreciate it. We need to continue with the agenda, but first we want to thank you, Chief Lowell, for being here, and also DC from being here. You stay late. You commit for much less time. We appreciate your time here. Of course, there's more questions, but we need to let you go. But we are very welcome that you were here and spend this time with the Police Accountability Commission. And we respond all the questions from the commissioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you.
Nice to see you. Bye. Okay, now we're gonna take a short break. It's 8:29. We're gonna take 5 minutes of break and we will come back because we have the rest of the agenda at 8:34. Thank you. And because we have several discussions in the agenda and only have around 26 minutes, we're gonna try to move this conversation and fast. And I will pass it to, okay, go to slide 15, please, if you can. Discussions on barriers to accountability and best practice. We need to have key takeaways, and please remember to be brief. Anyone can participate and then be facilitated and be constructive. Next on the agenda is a discussion of barriers to accountability and best practice. This is an open discussion. We ask you to follow our normal discussion rules. Would the co-chairs like to frame the discussion and then get it started? I will pass it to the co-chairs.
Sure. Thank you so much, Victoria. Thanks, everyone. Great questions. I know we all probably wish we had more time for questions, but hopefully they will be open to coming back for any other questions we might have. All right, so I think most of you know me. I'm Louisa Lloyd. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a co-chair of the full PAC for the fact-finding phase. And something that, this is a housekeeping note, something Commissioner Faith had mentioned earlier is that the point of these discussions is that the co-chairs will go back and we'll go back to this video and we'll go back to all the videos where we have these discussions about barriers and about best practices. And we'll use those video discussions as like a starting point for us to start drafting the barriers document for this phase of discussion. So that said, what we're going to be looking for is consensus points. And so don't feel bad for speaking up and agreeing with someone, because that actually really helps us. If you say, oh yeah, I really agree with that, or it's also great if you speak up and say, you know, I have another point of view, because that will just give us an idea of kind of where our ideas are at and where our consensus is at. That said, I wanted to kind of kick off the discussion by reading through a few of the notes that I had taken about things that Fromm and Lavelle had mentioned as some barriers, and some things that they had mentioned as some best practices. For barriers, they noted that, as we've heard before, it's a very complex process. It takes a lot of time. There are many steps. The perception of the current system is not favorable either from the point of view of officers who are in the system or the civilians who are trying to work the system, and that there is no buy-in from either end. Lavelle mentioned that the process becomes the punishment because it's so long, and also kind of raised this question of does a day off or does a letter in the file actually fix the problem, fix the underlying problem? Something that we mentioned in our discussions was just sort of the basic fundamental issue of the IA process is that cops are investigating themselves, and that there are a lot of interests at play here, unions, contracts, labor law, that officers go to appeal these administrative decisions. So best practices, some of those are cures, or some of those are somewhat solutions to some of those barriers. Best practices, things that are going well, the investigations are very thorough. There's a lot of ability to gather information and to go back to the investigation to fix or to ask what has not been asked yet. There's the ability to appeal on both sides. Lavelle mentions and recommends restorative processes and a lot of potential there. The possibility of an off-ramp in a complaint investigation. It sounds like there is pretty good separation between criminal and administrative investigations. Sometimes they do look to outside DA's offices if it appears there might be a conflict of interest for a serious criminal matter. Something I think Fromm mentioned that I thought sounded really interesting was, the idea of restorative discipline and the idea of community service. Officers may be doing some type of community service as a more creative approach to discipline, as opposed to just days off or a letter in the file. Yeah, so those were some of the things I had, and I would just love to hear if any of those really resounded with anyone, or if you had other things written down, other barriers, other best practices. We would love to hear them.
If the commissioners please make their comments. Again, we would like to have this discussion and then move to the second discussion on the agenda. Any comment, or you agree, or you have another point of view about this, or I'll have a question about the discussion? Yes, Commissioner Dan.
Thank you. You did capture, Co-Chair Lloyd, accurately that they said that they think the investigations are thorough, but I think people who've been through the system would argue with that. And I think even the IPR came and said that they can't be thorough because they don't have, in their opinion, it's because they don't have body cameras. Now, I think there are a lot of problems with body cameras because they point outward from the police officer, so you don't get to see what the police officer is doing. So it's really not going to solve all the problems that they think by having body cameras. But the point is that the IPR said a lot of times they can't gather it. And a lot of times the findings are what they call not sustained, what used to be called the insufficient evidence finding, because you can't tell one way or the other if the officer violated policy. So the investigations are only as thorough as the amount of information that they are able to or willing to pulled together, I think. They also, Chief Frome seemed to make it sound like the civilians are afraid of coming out in public and talking about their complaints. I think that there have been some instances of that over the years, but for the most part, the people who don't show up at the hearings that we have now, the Citizen Review Committee hearings, are the officers. And the few times they did show up, the community members went easier on them, most like 7 out of 8 times, than they would have otherwise done so if the officer hadn't shown up in person and showed them that they're a human being. So I think that we should be thoughtful about not trying to keep the future hearings away from the public eye because we're afraid of what the community members might experience. We should let them make their own decisions about that. But the thing I found most striking, and I put an exclamation point next to it in my notes, was the comment from Chief Frome that they really would enjoy being freed up from being the ones making the decision about discipline, because that way they can talk about it all they want. And that's basically what the voters asked for. They want the review board to be the ones making the decision about discipline. And I don't know how that jives with that Loudermill hearing, the Supreme Court ruling that gives the officers the ability to have one more appeal after discipline gets decided. But that's a very interesting thing to examine. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Dunn. Commissioner Faith?
Yeah, Lavisa, I captured a lot of the same things in my notes. And I think one of the barriers that Deputy Chief Frome identified was as he was talking about alluding to like the inflexibility of the investigation of once you start down one path, you're down that path. And his desire would to be at an intervention sooner of like asking the questions, are they asking the right questions in the investigation? And I think Chief Lavelle touched on that a little bit as well, of that the current system, I heard him like making the invitation for flexibility based on the action or inaction. And that is complicated for us. But I think it's an important thing I'm flagging for my future self to remember that, and that they were both open to kind of the discussion of repair beyond, like, I appreciated that Chief Lavelle identified that, like, for a person, having a letter in a police officer's file is not meaningfully repairing an injustice. And I appreciated the seemingly openness to explore what other restorative or transformative processes could be put in place.
Thank you, Commissioner Faith. Commissioner Catherine?
Thank you. And I just want to say, I thought Lavisa did a really good job of capturing most of my points that I also took down. I just wanted to follow up on Dan's point, because I thought it was pretty funny that, I mean, I noticed the same thing, and it echoed a little bit of what both Commissioner Wheeler and Maps said, that they also weren't comfortable necessarily being the decision makers on these cases. So clearly it's a specialized area, and one that I think, at least the theme from all of those folks is that the people doing this really need to be well-trained and well-supported in doing it. And that there's downsides to being the decision maker. The other thing I wanted to point out or flag or lift up was just, I thought that DC Frome's point at the end in responding to the transparency point was an interesting one. Transparency or lack of transparency is obviously a barrier. I thought he had kind of an interesting idea of allowing some kind of at least anonymous tracking of cases, so that there's at least some ability for the public to go and see there's these cases pending. They generally involve this kind of conduct. This is where they're at in the process. This is how long they've been pending. And if they're resolved, here's the resolution. So that at least people have an idea that there is a process. The process is going on and people can check on it. There is some kind of, there would be some kind of publicly accessible site where you can go and track the progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Catherine. Commissioner Jason?
Just commenting back on Catherine's comment that I heard some insincerity in that we don't want to be the ones to do this. It's their job to do it. They worked hard to get there. It's their career apex to do this. It's the key powers that they have as chief and deputy chief of police. So I guess I'm searching here also to think about what is the level of discipline that halts bad behavior, and what is the level of discipline that checks bad behavior. And if someone's just getting a letter in their file that they don't read, that's not really discipline. That's not really oversight at all. You have this elaborate process that ends up in a negotiated result. The guy who kicked James Chassie to death was never told that he did something wrong. No one from the Portland Police Bureau or the city of Portland ever told him that he did something wrong. And when he was deposed by the family's attorney, he said he had not done anything wrong. He had acted within policy. So I would hope that our research and thinking is about what is the level of discipline necessary to alter behavior. And I'm not sure what that is now, but I think we might look at other cities to see what they do.
Thank you, Commissioner Jason. Is there any other more comments or any questions? Yeah, Commissioner Christian, please. Go ahead. I think you are in mute.
That was my problem.
Can you talk now? Do you have? We cannot hear you.
No, still no.
Oh, is okay.
Put it in the chat.
Put it in the chat, or we can go back to you. Yeah, we keep trying. We want to hear what you have to say, or put it on the chat and I can read it. Thank you, Commissioner Christian. Who else would like to comment? Yes, Commissioner Monica, go ahead.
Hi, sorry I was late. I was really busy at work and I missed the beginning. So, but jumping in the middle and just listening to a lot of the things that we're saying, the one thing that kept jumping back to my head was it's going to be really hard to change behavior with just discipline if the behavior is going to stay the same. If the role of the police is to basically monitor poverty and drug addiction and mental illness, and that's not going to be, if that's not going to change, then we're going to be in kind of the same problem, right? Like I want somebody to investigate who murdered someone, right? But I would like to change the mentality of what the role of the police is. And I know that that is kind of out of our scope, but if discipline can kind of help us get to that, I think it would be a little more productive. I'm worried about this cycle, right? The cycle that continues, that this job is not going to take care of that. That's just what I wanted to say. It's kind of what I've been reflecting on.
Thank you, Commissioner Monica. And then Commissioner Sima.
Yeah, I'd really like to offer my appreciation for Commissioner Arce on her words just now, because I mean, You know, and I know that it's subjectively, it's not something that helps kind of move the needle forward. It's a bit anecdotal, but you know, when this is important to be able to share with our community. You know, the fact that I advocate for a couple families, separate situations where their loved ones have been murdered. This is gun violence, right? And you know, there is no needle moving forward when it comes to investigation. It's been months for a few of these families, and the closest they've come to hearing anything was having very high official representatives of Portland Police. And I'm talking about at high levels, assistant chief, you know, a community liaison, these folks communicating blatant lies that investigations are hampered simply because they've been defunded and that they've lost 300 officers to defunding. And this is kind of what we're up against. And this is, you know, you're hearing these this is present day language. And so when I have Chief Fromm and Chief Lavelle come on and they say these things, and at a high level, they show a very big disconnect and the reason why there's a valley, you know, and minimizing their position of accountability. It's invented, and this is kind of what we're up against. We're up against smoke and mirrors. We're up against being lied to, and we're up against having been lied to in very sophisticated senses. So our job is one that is cloaked in privilege, and sometimes our processes and our disagreements and, you know, how we belabor sometimes really lengthens out exactly like, you know, how we arrive to a true and possible accountable system. I'm very grateful for our commission. I'm grateful for every single member on here. And I just want to let you guys know that I'm very grateful to be going through this process with all of you. I'm grateful for our staff and our growing staff. I'm grateful for our facilitators. And I think these are incredible things that we're actually all involved in together. So as I sit here and I go through some anecdotal experiences that kind of constantly remind me that I can't undo the fact that I feel like I'm being lied to consistently when I do listen to power. But I think that's healthy. And you guys help balance that out for me. And again, I show my appreciation for being here. But again, you know, these aren't things that I wanted to bring up. I wanted to bring up, hey, you know, your folks are lying to my families who've lost loved ones to gun violence.
Thank you, Commissioner Sima.
Anyway, so
yeah.
I appreciate everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. I will pass it first to Commissioner Christian to see if he can, after Commissioner Christian, and if you, Commissioner Lovisa, can keep it very short because we need to move on. But Commissioner Christian, you wanna try again?
Is it working?
Yes, we can.
There you go. Yeah. Sorry, my headphones are I won't say a swear word, but they're not great. So I had to switch to new ones. I think that was what it was. I have to try and remember what I was going to say now. Everything that everyone has said has been very poignant. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but I have agreed with everything. Lots of interesting points. I think what Jason said made me think, and Angie, I think it was Angie, I'm not sure, maybe it wasn't Angie who spoke. I can't remember. Someone else said something that I thought was really interesting as well. The smoke and mirrors comment by CMOB was a good reminder too. I tend to take things at face value. So when I heard them talking, I was like, this is going well. And then I was like, oh, I have to remember that they're working within a larger system that's also kind of, you know, that they're restricted by a lot of things. I think we touched on that too when we were talking to them. But the main thing that I wanted to bring up, and someone else commented on it too, was when Fromm talked about at the end, or Fromm, I'm not sure how to pronounce their name, but that at the end they talked about the accountability and they mentioned the possibility of having like a tracking system or a website. I think that we mentioned something like that earlier, where if that the new system should be kind of user friendly. That kind of touched to me. That was a connection that I made, where I thought that if we did do something like that, it would basically making it accessible enough to the public so that when they go through the process, they are able to navigate it pretty easily without having to have a super big learning curve. Yeah, that was just a connection that I made in there. I think that was the only thing I was going to say. But I have agreed with everything, and it's all been really great. Thanks everyone for sharing. Cool.
Thank you, Commissioner Christian. And then I will pass to Commissioner Lovisa brief, and then we have to go to public comments. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, everybody, so much for your comments and your input. Christian, I agree with you. I also wrote down that I thought that, yeah, we had talked about like some type of an online trackable system, maybe anonymized, that would add some level of transparency. And I thought that was pretty cool that they mentioned it, they suggested it. I wanted to say that I agree with CMOB, and thank you for bringing up this issue of politics and how much politics impact everything that happens regarding police accountability. And I thought it was very interesting. I mean, I sort of added it under my list of, here's like the interests that they name check. They mentioned many times that there are interests that even they are up against that are more powerful than they are. The unions, the union, the contracts, the labor law, the politics of the situation. And yeah, I think that sort of speaks to a pretty major barrier to how this work is going to go. But yeah, that's very important. And thank you, CMOB, for mentioning that.
Thank you, Commissioner Lovisa. Now we will take public comment on the issues of the PAC is discussing. Our community members can also tell the story about policing and police accountability. We ask members of the public to keep their comments or questions to 2 minutes in length and raise their hand in Zoom if you like to speak. Now it's time for public comment. Okay. Okay, I see one person. Please, Rochelle, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but thank you for being here and for your raising your hand. Go ahead.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm hoping that if you do consider a disciplinary schema, that you include community service. As you clearly stated, having a letter in their file does absolutely no good, but neither does time off, a day or 2 weeks, as it's very easy for police to get private duty jobs. And so it means nothing to them to have a day off because they just go get a job someplace else. In addition, I think community service might help with transparency a bit and give the officer an opportunity to walk in someone else's shoes as a way to help make a culture change. Thank you for allowing me to talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Rochelle, for your comment. We appreciate it. Now I'm gonna call on Jasmine. Jasmine, thank you for being here. Go ahead.
Hey, everybody, can you hear me?
Yes,
Awesome. I was going to make a suggestion that if you haven't already, take a look at the data that's available on the IPR website. They have quite a bit of stuff there, and it gives you a good sense of how this data is normally packaged and sanitized. And it would be interesting, I think, exercise for you all to see what sort of questions come up when you look at the data, what you find is missing, what you would want to see that isn't there. Because there's actually kind of a glut of data for people looking for it around all of these systems, but the data doesn't always represent meaningful or useful information. So that's it for me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jasmine, for your comment and for being here. Now I'm gonna call Pamela. Pamela? I don't know if she's ready. Okay, thank you, Pamela. Please go ahead. Can you unmute yourself? You're on mute. Okay. Okay, I don't think they, I was confused. I think they raised their hands. Okay. Go ahead. Then is there nobody else that have raised their hand? Then thank you. Thank you for everyone from the public that make comments and some suggestions. Thank you very much. Now we're gonna move to the next steps. And the next steps is the subcommittee on the research co-shares. We are gonna move into the discussion of the co-chairs for the fact-finding phase of the subcommittee on research. Under the internal process document approved by the membership on May 19, each subcommittee has 2 co-chairs who serve for one phase of the work. These subcommittees co-chairs have a list of tasks similar to, but shorter than, the full commission and co-chairs, and will be supported by full commission and co-chairs CIMAP, Lovisa, and FAY during this phase. The full commission approves subcommittees co-chairs. At present, there are 2 candidates for 2 positions as co-chairs of the subcommittee on community engagement events, Commissioner Angie and Commissioner, no, it's not the community engagement events, no. Commissioner Angie and Commissioner Sophia. Before we move into discussion of who should be the co-chair, are there any questions on the process at this time? And I know it's gonna be for the subcommittee on research. I'm sorry, on the research. And the Commissioners Angie and Commissioner Sophia are the 2 candidates. Are there any questions on the process? Commissioner Faith?
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have a question on the process. I was just excited about their volunteering and wanted to formally nominate them. So I jumped ahead.
Okay. No, that's perfect because I don't think there is any questions on the process unless there is any question. No, you're perfect timing. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Commissioner Angie, Commissioner Sophia. You two like little besties. Thanks for working together again and volunteering for the research subcommittee. So I guess I'd like to nominate y'all for that. And I don't know, do we vote? Is that what happens now?
Yes. Okay. Now we go to the vote. Oh, yes. Is there a consensus so Commissioner Angie and Sophia could be approved to serve as a co-chairs of the Police Accountability Commission Subcommittee and Research for the phase of work? If there is consensus, please raise your hand or your thumbs. There is consensus. Yes, there is consensus. Congratulations, then Commissioner Angie and Sophia have been approved to serve as co-chairs of the Police Accountability Commission Subcommittee and Research for this phase of work. Okay. Now we can go to the garden plot recap. Is there any items? Samir and Ayomide, is there any items in the garden plot recap?
I personally do not have any items. Samir, are there any items that you collected?
No, there's nothing that we didn't already discuss. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Then we are going to end this meeting. I'm going to adjourn this meeting on 9:05 on June 16, 2022. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, the interpretation. Thank you for the commissioners. Thank you for the public members that have been with us here. We really appreciate it. And I cannot read the slide because it's so small, but if Ayomide can read it for me. Thank you, slide. If it's necessary, you can read it. It's so small in my computer. You are in mute.
Thank you for your contribution today. Thank you also for the interpreters for supporting access to the meeting of the Police Accountability Commission and its subcommittees for all of Portland. Thank you to the members of the public for being here and contributing your questions and thoughts. You can give written public comment in advance of future meetings at tinyurl.com/Portland PAC comment. Please sign up for email updates on the Police Accountability Commission at tinyurl.com Portland PAC updates. Thank you for your time. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Ayomidi. Good night. Thank you very much.